Good morning, friends. Good to see you. I can just see Olive's on. I don't know who else is watching. Good to see you all today. It's lovely to have a bit of sun, to feel the warmth on the back, but it's definitely starting to change, isn't it? Friends, just a couple of notices before we start. The first one is thank you to Richard and Morag for the beautiful music that they play on Friday. If you want to tune into that, morning, Marlene and Renik, good to see you. If you want to tune into Morag and Richard's music, you just do that on a Friday at 4 o'clock on Facebook. So you just look at it then. The pub quiz, which was going to be this Friday, has been moved to once a month. So it's the last Friday of the month. We will have the pub quiz. So looking forward to that. Morning, Bill and Anne. Good to see you. And for those who are giving financially to the church at the moment, thank you so much. If you would like to give more, please let us know at this time. Good. Friends, I just want to give a notice to you about church opening. We're in the process of wading through the documentation to do risk assessments about the church opening. We have a meeting on the 16th of July, 16th of this month, with the elders or the Kirk session and the board to discuss what's actually happening, how we're going to open. We're in the process of, as I said, doing a risk assessment. All I can say is that it's probably likely that the church or Abbott Hall won't be opening up this month, but there is a strong possibility next month, with a couple of caveats, we'll be opening. It also depends on what our R number is. I don't know if you saw in the news, Nicholas Sturgeon was saying that the R number is 1.4, which is means it's quite high. So we're still watching the situation quite carefully. So what's going to happen is, once we've agreed on a way of opening up, morning Anne and Betty, once we've agreed on a way of opening up, we're going to publish it in the church newsletter. There'll also be some Facebook videos that you can watch. I just realized I've got a bit of a fault here. There'll be some Facebook videos you can watch, and that should be able to guide you about what's going to be happening regarding face coverings, washing your hands, all that kind of stuff. It won't be the traditional sense of the service, so it's just to let everybody know about it. Morning, Rena. And Nancy. So as I say, we're in the process of working the whole thing out. As you can imagine, it's a giant hairball. Other churches in Kirkcaldy might be ahead of us in terms of opening, but the line that I've taken, and those who are working together to get this open, has been one that we'd rather be safe than sorry. And we would rather wait a little bit and make sure that our cleaning regiment is right, that everything is right before we open our doors. So just because another church is potentially opening, please don't see that as us slacking. It's rather we're being more cautious, because if we're honest, there's a large percentage of the people that come to the church that are in the vulnerable category, and the last thing we want is to put anyone at risk. So that's what's happening. So just watch the space, watch the space in terms of newsletters and all of that today as it comes out. Morning, Margaret. Good. So that's where we are at the moment. As I say, I can't give you too much more information about what is happening. Good. Today's reading comes from Matthew 18:15-20, and it's quite a famous reading, and it's got to do with conflict and about a little bit of infighting that's happening. And it goes like this. If your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault, just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. Truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, truly I tell you, that if two of you on earth agree about anything they ask for it, it will be done for them by their Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 gather in my name, there I am with them. I'm going to show you a picture quickly. I'm going to pull it up. And here it is. I don't know if you can see that picture. In that picture, you will see a Christ, obviously, and it's called Christ of the Andes. And this picture is on the border of Argentina and Chile. And this was erected a couple of years ago as a symbol of the good relationships that Argentina and Chile celebrated with each other. The problem was that after they built this statue, there was a bit of a conflict that arose from it. And the reason it arose is because the face of Christ was pointing towards Argentina, and the back of Christ was pointing towards Chile. And the Chileans were upset about this, and there was almost a riot until in a newspaper article, the editor of the newspaper wrote that the reason that it was like this was because that the Argentinians needed more help, and therefore Jesus needed to look at them a bit more. And that stopped the rioting that had happened. I think this is a bit of an anomaly because I don't think as humans we're very good with conflict. In fact, I think we've got a terrible track record as humans. We either don't say what we mean, or we say with what we say without thinking, and we cause huge hurt, and the consequences just spiral on. You can see in the amount of wars that have been fought throughout history that we're not very good at figuring the ways out to actually get along. And that is repeated day in and day out in our own lives as well, whether it be that personal or in the social realm. We seem to somehow as people be able to hurt each other, both physically and mentally. And so humanity as a whole doesn't really have a good track record when it comes to dealing with conflict. The church, we think, should have a better role than that, but the church has not always been the best at working out its own issues. We can see it in this country, in the UK as a whole as well. When the trouble started in Ireland, there was a huge division between Catholic and Protestant. And in Scotland, you still have schools. And I always found it fascinating that you had 2 entrances to schools. I lived in West Pilton for a while. And in West Pilton's a school. And on one entrance, you've got an entrance for Catholics. And the other side, you've got an entrance for other people. Why not just have the same entrance? And so the church has not always been at the forefront. In fact, in some ways, it's perpetuated more conflict than it's solved. And in this verse, Jesus is talking about conflict, but he does this model where he says, well, if someone does something to you, or you perceive someone to do something to you, go up to them and tell them what has happened. And so it starts off by saying one-on-one. But then he says if the one-on-one doesn't work, well, then go 2-on-1 and say, like, actually get a witness, speak to the person. And if they don't listen, then, well, then at least another person is heard. And then you can go with the whole church. So the whole church goes against one person. And I always thought that this was a good model for dealing with conflict. If you have an issue, go speak to the person directly. If they don't listen, well, get someone else to go with you. And if they don't listen, well, go get your big brother or something like that to listen, to help deal with conflict. And that works to a point, doesn't it? It works to a point, but the problem is that it doesn't always work that way. In fact, when conflict is it happens, it can be very complex. It can be difficult. It can be one of these things that, well, the one-on-one and the two-on-one just doesn't cut the mustard. So, and the reason is that, for me, is that because when people are joined together, when people come together, it becomes a political thing. When we have people together, it becomes political. And what I mean by political is not that we have political parties, is political for me is how we order ourselves. We order ourselves, the hierarchy, the structures, everything about that is a political thing. So, and within these structures, you get a hierarchy, and within these structures of hierarchy, you get favorites. And so, not every case in this way is going to be dealt with effectively. Not all conflict is going to be dealt with fairly. So, let me give an example of this. Say now someone stands up in a church environment and goes to somebody who's sexually molested them. And we've seen this in the church in the last couple of years, or last century or so in particular. And they go to the church and they say, you know what, you've hurt me and I'm going to go get other people. And nothing happens. It falls on deaf ears. It falls on deaf ears because the church doesn't want to recognize the issue. And then subsequently, the priest comes, or somebody comes, and the minister comes and lays an accusation against this person. And eventually, the whole church gets behind the priest or the minister, and the person who actually had something happen to them is cast out of the system. Now, both have followed the same model, but both have different consequences. So conflict can be very complicated because we're not just dealing with very, base level structures. We're dealing with people that, have positions of power, people who are favorites. We're dealing with friendships. I mean, it's difficult to go against your friend, isn't it? It's difficult. And so conflict that Jesus is talking about, is, in my opinion, a lot more complicated than we first understand. So this kind of thing that Jesus talks about is great in theory, but in principle, it can be used as a weapon by those in power. And what I found interesting as I was reading this text is that it doesn't define sin. It says, in this version, it says, if your brother or sister sins, go and point it out. In other versions of the Bible, it's in other manuscripts, ancient manuscripts, it says, if they sin against you. But it doesn't say what that means. What happens when somebody has hurt you, but it's perceived hurt? We know that humans are fickle, and that not everything that we see as wrong is wrong, or it can get also quite muddy in that water. And so the other is true, is what happens when two people have perceived that the person, or that both have sinned against each other. This is a great example of this is the Troubles again. Both sides seem to think that the other side is guilty. It's not just one side saying you're guilty, but both sides seem to think that the other one is the perpetuator of sin. So again, it gets quite complicated, even just looking at this verse. But as I started reading, I started to discover more and more about this text. And I think the best thing to do is to go a bit backwards. And if we look at the context of the social context of the day, a couple of things jump out. The first thing is there was no police or judiciary in the sense like we have it today. So the way that societies created control and harmony was by having a set of rules. They had these rules, and each community had dozens of rules. And in the ancient world, if you broke the community rules, what would happen is that the first step was that they would take away your food ration. Food was shared as a community, they would take away your food ration. And so basically what they would do is they would make you hungry and then almost force you into asking for forgiveness, or almost force you to go with their train of thought. And if that didn't work, if they couldn't get you hungry enough to change your opinion, they dished out even more discipline. And the last place that they did that was they would expel you from the community. And in a community, like for us, we travel around, but in a community where people stayed put, being ostracized out of that community was like death. You were living in hell. You were alive, but you wished you were dead. And one of the instructions in these communities was that people were not allowed to support you if you'd been expelled. People were not allowed to support you or your family because they believed you were cursed from God. So within a social context, it gets really quite messy because it was designed to keep people in line with the same track of thought. If you disagreed, they didn't want that. It was designed with this tunnel vision in place. The next thing that if you read these texts is that it is in a place in the book of Matthew. Just before this is the story of the sheep, the wandering sheep. There's 100 sheep, one goes missing, the 99 stay behind, but the shepherd goes and looks for the one sheep. You probably know that story. So that's just before this thing about conflict. And just after this conflict verses is the parable of the unmerciful servant. And basically in this parable, it's about two servants who borrow money, and one servant gets forgiven and the other one doesn't. And it's just quite complicated. But at the beginning of this verse, of this thing about the unmerciful servant, Jesus is asked the question, how many times should I forgive? And his answer is 70 times 7, which is basically continue forgiving. So these verses is not about just conflict, it's about restoration. Jesus in this section is talking about restoring things. And in the middle of this verse of dealing with sin or dealing with people that have hurt you is this. It says, if they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. Now this is where it gets inciting for me. The old pattern was that when you treated them like a pagan or a tax collector, you pushed them out. You told them they had no value, they were cursed by God. You didn't want anything to do with them. That was what you were told. But if you read this in the context of Jesus' life, how does Jesus teach, or how does Jesus treat tax collectors? How does he treat people who aren't Jewish? Because pagan basically means non-Jewish. People who don't believe the same things as you. How do you treat them? Do you toss them to the curb? Or do you do what Jesus did? Do you do what Jesus did when he did with Zacchaeus? What did he do, Zacchaeus? Well, Jesus didn't tell Zacchaeus what a terrible person he was. Zacchaeus and Jesus had a conflict because their lives were totally different. But Jesus and Zacchaeus found this middle ground. And even the book of Matthew, this book has been attributed to Matthew. And who was Matthew? Matthew was a tax collector. How does Jesus treat tax collectors? Makes them disciples. Jesus puts people who have different worldviews together. Jesus never threw people out, but rather learned from them. Wanted to hear their story. Why do you believe what you believe? Why do you think this way? Why have you done this? Jesus doesn't dismiss them and say they are cursed by God, but rather embraces their story. As I said a bit earlier, conflict is nuanced. And some situations, I'm going to caveat the rest of this, but some situations you need to leave straight away. No ifs, no buts, you need to get out of. I'll give you an example of this. There was a minister in America called John Piper. And John Piper runs quite a strong following on a website called Discovering God or Desiring God, something like that. And interestingly enough, John Piper has an understudy called Justin Taylor, but who would have thought? Anyway, and John Piper said this. A woman wrote into him and said, "My husband is abusing me. What do I do?" And John Piper said, "You need to stay in your marriage. You need to stay in your marriage and you should not leave. You should go tell your husband, and if he doesn't listen, get 2 people and then get the whole church involved." You know? And basically what John Piper was saying is like, bring all your hurt and pain into the public domain and stay with this person who's hurt you. And can I tell you something? I disagree totally with that. Some bits of conflict are so toxic that the best way to deal with them is to just cut them off. Finished. Just walk away. Just walk away. Because to stay in a toxic place is not helpful. But I don't think this is what Jesus is talking about in these verses. What I think Jesus is talking about in these verses is how we form a new community. He's saying, what I think Jesus is talking about here is, don't ostracize those who think differently from you or behave differently from you. Because it's those people that are the ones that open our worldview. It's the people that we throw away, the tax collectors, the pagans, the people not like us. Those are the ones who are our teacher. And Jesus goes on to talk about where 2 or more gathered in my name, there I am. I grew up in apartheid, as you'll know, and it was a religious system. Apartheid was first and foremost a religious system before it was a political or government policy. There were 2 or more people gathered in those synods or those rooms making up these policies. Was God in the midst of that? Can we really be honest about that? No, just because you have the same people thinking the same things doesn't mean it is equal to God being in the room. In fact, you can have this, you can talk about God and you can be on the same mindset and totally miss the point. The 2 or more gathered doesn't necessarily mean that all of a sudden God gives you the thumbs up. I'm in the midst of that. No, what Jesus is talking here is that when you come with your perspective of God and the world, and I come with my perspective of the world of God, and we come and we're not trying to manipulate each other, and we're just trying to listen to each other. In the middle, when you come with that and I come with that, in the middle, we get a bigger picture of what reality is, what God is like. In the midst of that conflict of minds and worldviews, we can actually learn something. We can actually move forward. So that conflict where two people are coming from totally different worldviews, can be a blessing. It can be an absolute blessing. It can move us forward. It can open our horizons. Here's the problem, friends, is that I don't think we're very good at living what Jesus taught out. We still hold on to a value where our tribe, our community, our way of understanding, the way we see the world is the most important value. The most important value for us is to have uniformity. We want people to see the world the way we do. We want ethics to reflect that. We want the rules, whether it's written in government policy or it's written in the words we speak, or the words that we don't write down, the way we should behave. Those rules, we want people to follow them. And what happens is that we bully people. We bully people for not believing or owning or living the way that we set out. We bully them. And I see this time and time again. We are bullying people who disagree with this. Even in the public sphere, if someone disagrees with you, or somebody has a different viewpoint from you, or a group of people, it is absolute annihilation. We will throw everything we have to prove how unworthy they are. I don't know if you saw this, and this was something that sparked this off. Did any of you watch some of the speeches at the Democrat and Republican conventions? I don't know if you saw it, but the Republican convention was all about how bad the Democrats are. How they're going to come and do this and do that and do that. And then the Democratic one was about exactly the same. The Republicans are this and this and this and this and this and this. And it was just a mudslinging. It wasn't a conversation about actually how do we move together forward. It wasn't about how do I hear you and move forward. It was actually how do I just polarize each other. It wasn't about that nuance. I saw it in the Brexit and Remain campaign. I saw it in the independence and the Better Together together conversation. I saw it, or I see it in sexual orientation. The way that people get upset with people of different sexual orientations or understandings on both sides. On both sides. Friends, it's happening all around us. That it's not about working out that middle ground. It's about ostracizing each other. And what I'm discovering is we will fight so hard to be right that we will miss the humanity of the other person. We will fight so hard that our view is the right view. We will post hundreds of comments on Facebook and Twitter and all these things. Or we'll have those conversations in the park where we demean someone or whatever. We start to expel people, call them all the names under the sun. And what we are doing in this moment is we refuse to see their humanity and that they too are a child of God. And that they too are a child of God. And you know what it is all, if you boil it down to its basic level, it's just insecurity. We are insecure, so we have to bully other people to see the world the way we do. And the worst thing of this all, utter worst thing of this all, is that we convince ourselves that God is on our side and not on theirs. We convince ourselves that God is on our side and they're nothing. I want to show you another picture. And this is me walking in to, let's see if that works. It's me walking in to Cape Town, and it's called the Methodist Mission, and it's in the central of Cape Town. And this is the mirror If you look at the top, you'll see it says, "You are beautiful." And at the bottom, if you look carefully, there, "And so is your enemy." You are beautiful, and so is your enemy. And this is as you walk into the church. Friends, if conflict is going to do anything, it needs to move us forward. We need to be people where two or more are present, that we're not fearful of each other, but rather we're listening and engaging and we're learning from each other. That we're opening ourselves up, even when it's uncomfortable to listen. That we move away from our addiction of being right. And as we do that, I'm convinced in the midst of that God is there. I'm convinced that we'll find a bigger picture of God. We are all created differently. You and I, we're all different. We will see the world differently. We have different life experiences. Surely that is something to be celebrated, not to be pushed out. We will rub each other up the wrong way. Yes, we will, because we have different experiences and different understandings. But that is how we learn, and that is how we grow. So, friends, conflict. What camp are you in? Are you in the camp that is trying the old way, of pushing other people away, telling them how bad they are? Or are you part of the conversation, the new way, where Jesus is inviting us into conversation, uncomfortable conversation at times, but in so doing, we open up a well of experience. Friends, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Thank you for your time. If there is anything I can do, or if you would like to have a chat with me, please get in touch with me. If you're still listening, I know it's been a long one, please hit the thumbs up button at the bottom. If you're in YouTube land, please thumbs up as well. It just means that this is shared more widely. And I leave you with a blessing. Friends, may you discover the gift of each other. May you discover that we are not against each other, but our conflict is God's way of bringing healing and restoration into the world. And the blessing of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit remain with you all, now and forevermore. Amen.